Imagine waking up one morning, and by nightfall, half the people you know are dead. Not sick, dead. Now, imagine that happening not in one city, but across an entire continent, for 7 years straight. Here is what makes this even more disturbing. We have the death counts, we have the eyewitness accounts, we have the mass graves, and scientists still cannot agree on what actually caused it. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. That is not a typo. The margin of uncertainty is 125 million human lives. And the debate over what pathogen caused it? It is still open. This is not just history. What happened in 14th century Europe is a blueprint, a warning that keeps getting ignored. Because the conditions that made that plague unstoppable, most of them exist right now. Stay with me, because this story does not end in medieval graveyards. It ends in a question you will not be able to shake. To understand how a plague could kill half a continent, you first have to understand how fragile that continent already was. By the early 1300s, Europe was dangerously overcrowded. A warming climate over the previous 3 centuries had produced bumper harvests, and the population had exploded, tripling in just 300 years. Cities like Paris and London were packed far beyond anything their infrastructure could support. Streets were open sewers. Animals lived alongside people. The concept of quarantine did not exist. Then the climate shifted. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced the Great Famine. Years of catastrophic rainfall, failed crops, mass starvation. An estimated 10 to 25% of the population in some regions died from hunger alone. Immune systems were depleted. Social order was beginning to crack. Nobody knew it, but Europe had just been primed. Into this weakened, overcrowded, malnourished world, something was coming from the east. The trail goes cold somewhere in Central Asia, around the year 1346. Genoese trading posts on the Black Sea coast reported something terrifying moving through Mongol territories. Contemporary accounts describe sudden fever, blackened lymph nodes, and death within days. The Mongol army, besieging the city of Kaffa in Crimea, began dying faster than they could fight. In one of history's most catastrophic decisions, they allegedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. The Genoese traders inside fled by ship. Those ships carried the disease to Sicily in 1347. From there, it moved to Genoa, Marseille, and then, with terrifying efficiency, up through France, Spain, into England, and across Germany. It traveled along trade routes. The same roads that carried silk and spices now carried death. But here's where the debate begins. The conventional explanation is Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague spread by fleas on rats, and there's strong evidence for this. DNA extracted from medieval grave sites across multiple countries has confirmed its presence. But the numbers don't entirely add up. Bubonic plague in modern outbreaks has a mortality rate of roughly 30 to 60% when untreated. The Black Death in many regions killed 80% of those infected. It also spread during winter months when flea activity drops significantly, and it moved faster than rat populations travel. Some researchers propose a hemorrhagic fever. Others suggest anthrax. A minority argue for a pathogen that no longer exists. The debate is still open. And that uncertainty matters because if we've been preparing for the wrong disease, we could be caught completely off guard again. Once it hit mainland Europe,
the progression followed a brutal logic. More people packed together meant faster transmission. Faster transmission overwhelmed whatever primitive care systems existed. Overwhelmed care systems meant the sick were abandoned, which accelerated the spread further. It was a feedback loop with no break. The clergy who ran the hospitals died at catastrophic rates, removing the very people responsible for care. Doctors who approached patients died. Some towns buried their physicians within weeks of the outbreak's arrival. The economic system began to collapse. Supply chains broke. Farmers died mid-harvest, leaving crops rotting in the fields. Food prices spiked. People fled cities for the countryside and carried the disease with them. One chronicler in Florence wrote that the city fell from 90,000 people to fewer than 45,000 in a matter of months. He described bodies piled in streets because there was no one left to bury them. He described people dying mid-conversation. This was not just a disease, it was a systemic collapse, medical, social, economic, all happening simultaneously, each one accelerating the others.
By 1349, Europe did not just have a plague, it had a civilization in free fall. The church, the organizing institution of medieval society, had no answers. Prayers did not stop it. Confession did not stop it. Priests refused to give last rites out of fear. When the institution people had trusted with their souls could not protect their bodies, something fundamental broke. Flagellant movements exploded across Germany and the Low Countries. Groups of people publicly whipping themselves in penance, convinced the plague was God's punishment. They traveled from town to town, paradoxically spreading the very disease they were trying to escape. Then came the scapegoating. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells. Despite Pope Clement VI issuing 2 papal declarations explicitly condemning the violence and stating clearly that Jewish people were dying from the plague just like everyone else, the massacres continued. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive in February of 1349, before the plague had even arrived there. Fear had outpaced the disease. This is the pattern. It is always the pattern. When institutions fail and people are terrified, they find someone to blame and punish the innocent, while the actual threat continues unchecked. The responses were almost universally wrong. Bloodletting, draining blood from patients, was the standard medical intervention. It weakened an already dying immune system. Burning herbs to purify the air did nothing. Wearing beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic flowers was based on a theory of disease transmission that was completely incorrect. Venice did implement one innovation that actually worked: quarantine. Ships arriving in port were held for 30 days, then 40. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian word for 40. This helped, but it was inconsistently applied and came far too late. The knowledge that could have saved millions, germ theory, sanitation, the flea and rat transmission chain, was still 500 years away. People were trying to solve a microscopic problem with medieval tools. They were, to put it plainly, doomed to fail. Here is where this stops being history and starts being a mirror. The World Health Organization estimates that a severe pandemic today could kill 80 million people within 36 hours of emergence. Not because our medicine is primitive, but because our interconnectedness has made transmission faster than our response systems. A pathogen in Hong Kong can reach New York in under 15 hours via commercial aviation. COVID-19 showed us the pattern again. Denial in the early weeks, overwhelmed hospitals, supply chain disruption, institutional credibility collapse, and almost instant scapegoating of minority communities, all within months. Sound familiar?
The Black Death also permanently altered labor markets. With so many workers dead, peasants for the first time could demand higher wages. It destabilized feudalism. Some historians argue it planted the seeds of the Renaissance and the Reformation by shaking people loose from rigid institutions. Major disruptions do not just kill people, they restructure societies. The question is never whether a restructuring will happen, it is who it will benefit and who it will harm. 3 things this story makes impossible to ignore. First, interconnection is a double-edged sword. Trade routes in 1347, flight routes today, the same networks that create prosperity create vulnerability. Resilience requires building systems that can be deliberately slowed or isolated without complete collapse. Second, institutions that fail during a crisis do not just lose effectiveness, they lose legitimacy. And that vacuum gets filled with misinformation, scapegoating, and extremism. The fastest way to prevent radicalization in a crisis is to have institutions that demonstrably work before the crisis hits. Third, the unknown cause is not a footnote. It is the most important part. If we do not know precisely what killed 200 million people, we cannot be certain we would recognize it coming again. Epistemic humility in medicine and public health is not weakness, it is the only rational response to a world that keeps producing surprises. Here is the open question I will leave you with. The Black Death ended not because humans solved it, but because it burned through available hosts and eventually ran out of road. Not because of anything we did, it just stopped. Beat. We didn't beat it, we survived it, barely. Beat, and with no real understanding of why. Slow. The next one won't wait for us to figure it out either. Beat. If this video made you think differently about history, epidemics, or how societies break, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories where the past explains exactly what is happening right now. Because history does not repeat itself, but as someone once said, it does rhyme. And right now, it's starting to sound familiar.